Turns out museums aren't just full of priceless history, they're also full of oops. 1. The dino that wasn't. In the early 1990s, the National Museum of Natural History proudly displayed a fearsome dinosaur skeleton. Claws sharp, posture majestic, and teeth ready for showtime. It was billed as a velociraptor cousin, an apex predator that ruled the plains. The problem? It wasn't a dinosaur at all. After nearly a decade on display, a visiting paleontologist finally noticed something was off. The bones looked suspiciously, bird-like. Tests confirmed it was actually a mislabeled turkey vulture. Yep. For years, crowds admired what was essentially a prehistoric Thanksgiving dinner. The museum quietly removed the exhibit, but not before a generation of school kids grew up thinking birds were 9 feet tall and carnivorous. In a way, they weren't entirely wrong, just about 65 million years late on the timeline. 2. The ancient Greek statue that was made in 1982. A prestigious Italian museum spent years showing off a stunning marble statue, supposedly from 500 BCE. Scholars marveled at its realism, calling it one of the finest examples of early Greek artistry ever found. Then came the awkward part. The artist who sculpted it was still alive. He'd been creating historical replicas for fun and selling them at local fairs. Somehow, one of his pieces made its way into the hands of dealers who aged it with acid and dust before auctioning it off for millions. The museum never forgave itself for buying an ancient masterpiece with a faint scent of fresh marble polish. The artist? He became famous, not as a forger, but as the man who fooled every expert armed with a PhD and a magnifying glass. 3. The mummy that turned out to be a movie prop. For nearly 40 years, a small California museum proudly displayed a wrapped Egyptian mummy, dim lighting, glass case, and all. It drew in thousands of visitors, each marveling at the delicate linen and haunting history. In 1979, staff decided to X-ray the mummy for preservation records. That's when the truth unwrapped itself. Literally, the so-called ancient pharaoh contained no bones, no organs, just a wire skeleton, foam padding, and a tag reading "Property of Universal Pictures." The mummy had apparently been borrowed from a movie set in the 1930s and accidentally cataloged as authentic. The museum staff had been preserving Hollywood special effects for decades, proving that sometimes archaeology's greatest mysteries are solved by reading the fine print on the prop label. 4. The medieval sword made of aluminum. For over half a century, a European museum proudly showcased what it claimed was a 10th century Viking sword, said to have been wielded by a legendary warrior. Scholars praised it for its unusually light weight and flawless craftsmanship, calling it a marvel of early metallurgy. The only problem? Aluminum wasn't isolated or produced until the 1800s. Turns out, the sword wasn't forged by ancient Vikings. It was hammered out by a 19th century blacksmith with a flair for historical fan fiction. The ancient weapon had been accidentally swapped into the museum's collection after a local collector donated several replicas. The kicker: the museum had even used it in educational demonstrations about medieval combat. Generations of kids learned how Vikings pioneered lightweight alloy blades, a concept about 800 years too early. When experts finally ran a chemical analysis, the curator reportedly muttered, "Well, at least it didn't rust." The sword was quietly relabeled, and its new description simply read, "An inspiring work of 19th century imagination." That's curator speak for, "We messed up, but please keep buying tickets." 5. The Picasso. That wasn't in the late 1980s. A small American museum was thrilled to announce it had acquired an original Picasso sketch. It was donated by a local businessman who swore he bought it during a trip to Paris from a guy who knew a guy. The museum, eager for prestige, displayed it immediately, right next to a detailed plaque explaining how it represented Picasso's late minimalist period. For 25 years, art students wrote essays about it, critics praised its subtle chaos, and visitors admired the bold brushwork. Then one day, a visiting art historian noticed the giveaway. The signature read, "Picasso." A quick investigation revealed the piece had been mass-produced by a tourist shop in the 70s for $12.99, complete with a plastic frame and a faint "Made in Taiwan" sticker on the back. The museum had unknowingly spent decades worshipping the world's fanciest souvenir. When confronted, the director shrugged and said, "Well, it did inspire a lot of discussion." In academia, that's basically a refund policy. 6. The fossil that was half chicken. In 1999, a major natural history museum proudly unveiled what it called the missing link, a fossil combining features of both birds and dinosaurs. The press went wild. Headlines declared it the scientific discovery of the century, but when other experts got a closer look, something didn't sit right. Or rather, something didn't fit right. A detailed scan revealed the fossil wasn't a single animal at all. It was literally glued together from two different species, a bird and a small dinosaur. The Frankenstein fossil had been assembled by a clever forger in rural China who sold it to dealers for a few $100s. The museum, having paid hundreds of thousands, suddenly found itself holding what could only be described as prehistoric fan art. When the truth came out, staff quietly removed the fossil, but the damage was done. Paleontology students still call it the Great Jurassic Chicken Sandwich. Turns out, evolution might be complex, but human gullibility evolves even faster. 7. The ancient pot that was actually a chamber pot. In the 1950s, an archaeological museum in England proudly displayed a large, ornately decorated clay pot, labeling it as a ceremonial vessel used in Roman banquets. Scholars admired its detailed craftsmanship and theorized it had been used to serve wine to noblemen. For decades, it was treated with reverence, until a group of visiting plumbers pointed out something obvious. It had a drain hole. The sacred Roman artifact was actually a public restroom fixture, a first-century toilet bowl. Historians had spent years writing papers about the pot's supposed symbolism while standing in front of ancient plumbing. Once the truth came out, the exhibit's tone shifted dramatically. The museum replaced its dignified plaque with one that simply read, "Functional object, purpose disputed." The curator reportedly took it with grace, saying, "Well, it was part of daily Roman life." The pot remains on display, not as a relic of luxury dining, but as proof that sometimes history's greatest mysteries just need a good plumber to solve them. 8. The samurai armor that came from a Halloween store. In 2003, a Midwestern museum proudly debuted a new exhibit, a full set of Japanese samurai armor, supposedly dating back to the 1600s. It had everything: the ornate helmet, the lacquered chest plate, the dramatic facial mask. The director even called it a symbol of warrior honor and precision. Unfortunately, the armor's precision came from a factory in Tokyo. That made costumes for Halloween. The historic artifact was traced back to a chain store catalog from the 1980s, sold under the name Shogun Warrior Deluxe Set. The telltale sign? Plastic rivets. Real samurai armor used iron. This one used hot glue. For years, visitors admired it while school groups posed for pictures beside a fiberglass chest plate worth $79.99. When the truth surfaced, the museum quietly replaced the label with modern reproduction. But honestly, it had already done its job, inspiring 1,000 selfies and proving once again that history isn't always forged in battle. Sometimes it's forged in a factory with a discount coupon. 9. The Egyptian sarcophagus. That was a 19th century coffee table. In the 1920s, a British museum proudly displayed what it claimed was an authentic Egyptian sarcophagus, complete with intricate carvings and faded paint that screamed ancient curse. It was a major attraction. People lined up to gaze at the supposed resting place of a long-forgotten noble. For decades, scholars debated which dynasty it came from, and one even published a paper about its spiritual significance. But in 1985, a renovation worker made a shocking discovery while cleaning underneath. A faint inscription that read, "Property of Harrods Furniture Department." Turns out, the mummy case was actually a 19th century Victorian coffee table, carved in an Egyptian style. Part of a trend where wealthy Europeans decorated their parlors with exotic designs. The table had been passed down, misidentified, and eventually donated to the museum as the real deal. When the truth came out, the museum quietly moved it to the Cultural Imitations wing. Still, it remains one of their most beloved pieces, proving that, in archaeology, all it takes to turn a coffee table into an artifact is a century of misplaced confidence and a bad label. 10. The Revolutionary War uniform made in Taiwan. In the 1970s, an American museum received a rare Revolutionary War uniform from a patriotic donor who claimed it had been worn by his ancestor during the Battle of Saratoga. The fabric was faded, the buttons gleamed with the dull luster of age. It was perfect. Historians gushed over its preservation, and it became the centerpiece of the museum's colonial exhibit. But during a conservation check decades later, a curator found something odd. A stitched-in washing label that read "Machine Wash Cold," made in Taiwan. The uniform had actually been a high-quality reproduction purchased from a costume supplier in the 1950s. The museum had unknowingly honored polyester as a symbol of freedom. Visitors had stood in awe before a garment designed for community theater, not combat. When the discovery went public, the curator took it in stride, joking, "Well, technically it is vintage, just the wrong revolution." Today, the uniform remains on display with a revised description that calls it an example of modern myth-making. The irony? The fake uniform has now survived longer in a museum than many real ones did on the battlefield. 11. The medieval painting restored by a well-meaning grandma in Spain. A small church displayed a centuries-old fresco of Christ known as Ecce Homo. For generations, it had faded gently with time, until one local grandmother decided to help. Armed with store-bought paint and an unshakable sense of confidence, she set out to restore the sacred image herself. The result was unforgettable. The once detailed face of Jesus now resembled a confused monkey wrapped in a brown towel. Art critics called it the worst restoration in history. The internet called it a masterpiece of accidental comedy. The church, initially horrified, considered suing, until tourists started arriving by the busload just to see the infamous Beast Jesus. The untrained artist became an overnight celebrity, and the fresco, now fully rebranded as folk art, brought in more revenue than the church had ever seen. What began as a disaster turned into divine marketing. It's now protected by glass and insured, a modern relic of how one person's creative vision can accidentally turn an artifact of faith into the world's most famous meme. 12. The ancient stone tools that were actually railroad debris. For nearly a century, archaeologists in the American Midwest proudly displayed a collection of stone tools supposedly made by prehistoric tribes. The flint edges, the smooth handles, it all screamed early human craftsmanship. Scholars wrote papers, documentaries were filmed, and even school textbooks featured the discovery as proof of early American innovation. Then, in the 1990s, a geologist with a suspiciously good eye for patterns visited the exhibit. He noticed something familiar. The tools had perfectly uniform strike marks, identical to those made by modern machinery. After a detailed analysis, it was confirmed. The artifacts weren't from ancient hunters, but from 19th century railroad construction. The stones were fragments left over from blasting rock with dynamite, shaped not by human hands, but by industrial chaos. The museum had spent decades teaching history based on train wreckage. When the mistake became public, the curator sighed and said, "Technically, it's still part of American heritage." The mislabeled tools were kept on display, this time under a new title, Artifacts of Misunderstanding. Fittingly, they're now used in lessons about how even the smartest experts can be derailed by a really convincing pile of rocks. 13. The ancient skull that belonged to a coconut. In the 1960s, a coastal museum in Florida announced a jaw-dropping discovery, the skull of a previously unknown indigenous tribe found buried in seaside sand. The find was hailed as revolutionary. Newspapers called it the earliest evidence of pre-Columbian coastal life. Researchers carefully analyzed the structure, noting its unique cranial ridges and hollow eye sockets. It took nearly 15 years before someone finally asked the obvious question: why did it smell like sunscreen? After running a few tests, scientists realized the truth. The skull was not human, nor ancient. It was half of a decayed coconut shell, polished smooth by waves. Somehow, early excavators mistook it for bone, and no one had questioned the find for over a decade. The embarrassment was monumental. The museum quietly removed the exhibit, but locals weren't about to let it die. They nicknamed it Coco the Missing Link. Today, the coconut skull lives on as a beloved urban legend and a cautionary tale. In archaeology, sometimes the only thing separating discovery from disaster is a single curious nose sniffing the evidence. 14. The Viking helmet with horns, straight from Hollywood. For decades, a Scandinavian museum proudly showcased what it called an authentic Viking war helmet. It had the works, aged metal, leather lining, and, most famously, two glorious horns curling from the sides. It became a national treasure, symbolizing Norse courage and raw masculinity. Every tourist wanted a photo beside it. The only issue? Vikings never wore horned helmets, not once. Archaeologists finally re-examined the relic in 2016 and discovered it was made in the early 20th century as a stage prop for an opera. Performance of Der Ring des Nibelungen. The battleware had been forged in a theater workshop, not a smithy, using decorative brass and glue instead of iron rivets. Historians winced, realizing they'd spent 70 years romanticizing costume jewelry. The museum quietly reclassified it as a cultural artifact of Viking-inspired art, which is curator speak for oops. The irony is that Hollywood and opera created the very image of horned Vikings everyone now believes in, and this one fake helmet helped sell the myth for generations. It's less a relic of war and more a monument to humanity's favorite pastime, turning fact into fantasy, then charging admission. 15. The Roman coin minted in Las Vegas. In the 1970s, a Nevada museum proudly unveiled what it claimed was a Roman coin found in the desert. Proof, they said, that ancient explorers might have reached North America centuries before Columbus. The news made headlines. Conspiracy theorists rejoiced. Even academics hesitated to dismiss it outright. For decades, the mysterious coin sat in its glass case, gleaming under spotlights. Then one day, a local retiree came forward laughing. He'd lost that exact coin from his souvenir collection years earlier. It was a novelty token sold at Caesar's Palace Casino, minted to look ancient for a promotional event. The museum had mistaken a gambler's trinket for proof of transatlantic time travel. Experts confirmed it. The Roman engraving literally read, "Made in USA," beneath the patina. The museum sheepishly issued a statement thanking the public for helping advance historical accuracy. The coin remains on display under a new name, the artifact that proved nothing. It's a perfect reminder that sometimes the only thing ancient about a discovery is how long it takes to admit you've been duped by souvenir shop archaeology. 16. The ancient relic filled with cornflakes. In the 1930s, a British museum received a sealed clay jar believed to contain sacred offerings from an Egyptian tomb. The label warned, "Do not open, contains funerary contents." So they didn't. For almost a century, the mysterious jar sat untouched in climate-controlled reverence. Finally, during a 2019 audit, curators decided to peek inside using modern scanning technology. The results were crunchy. Instead of sacred relics or ancient grains, the jar was packed with early 20th century Kellogg's cornflakes. Apparently, during its excavation, a mischievous archaeologist swapped the original contents for breakfast cereal as a prank. The joke outlived him by nearly 80 years. The museum staff, torn between laughter and horror, confirmed that the cereal had fossilized into one solid brick of sugary amber. They decided to keep it sealed again, to preserve its historic absurdity. The exhibit now proudly tells both stories, one about ancient Egypt and one about British scientists who took "don't touch" a little too seriously. The world's oldest unopened cereal box might not teach us about the afterlife, but it sure explains why museums double-check their lunch breaks now. 17. The Aztec relic from Home Depot. In 2010, a regional museum in Texas proudly showcased a large carved stone head identified as a pre-Columbian artifact of Aztec origin. It weighed 400 pounds, looked intimidating, and even featured traces of ancient pigment. Archaeologists came to study it, until one observant visitor recognized the design from somewhere very modern, the outdoor decor section of Home Depot. Sure enough, the Aztec relic was a mass-produced garden ornament sold nationwide in the early 2000s. Someone had aged it with acid and dirt to look authentic before donating it to the museum. The staff had even built an entire exhibit around it, complete with dramatic lighting and tribal drum sound effects. Once exposed, the museum took it down, but not before it went viral online as Home Depot history. Ironically, the store saw a spike in sales of the same statue afterward, proving that even fake history can sell when the story's good enough. These days, the stone head sits behind glass again, this time labeled Modern Artifact, Early 21st Century Consumer Culture. In the end, it might be the truest exhibit they've ever had. 18. The Ancient Bible, that was printed last Tuesday. In 2015, a small-town museum in the U.S. Midwest announced the acquisition of what it believed was a priceless 15th century Bible, one of the earliest printed in Europe. It was found in a deceased collector's attic, bound in cracked leather, its pages browned with age. The museum celebrated with press releases and fundraising campaigns. But when experts arrived to authenticate it, they noticed something suspicious. The ancient ink smelled faintly of toner. Turns out, the entire Bible had been printed on modern inkjet paper and artificially aged in an oven. Even the binding had a barcode sticker hidden under the spine. The museum had unknowingly spent $25,000 on a homemade replica printed from a free online PDF. When news broke, locals started calling it the Gospel according to HP DeskJet. The director handled it gracefully, saying, "Well, it's still the Word of God, just in higher resolution." The fake Bible now sits proudly in its own case, with a plaque that reads, "Lesson number 1 in faith, always double-check the printer settings." 19. The prehistoric carving made by a drunk tourist. In 1977, a European natural history museum proudly displayed a limestone slab etched with what experts called evidence of prehistoric art. The carving resembled a primitive animal, supposedly tens of thousands of years old. Scholars declared it a rare glimpse into early human creativity. Tour guides wove poetic stories about the dawn of imagination. Decades later, during a restoration, a technician noticed something odd: the ancient tool marks matched modern metal carving blades. After further analysis, the truth came out. The piece had been defaced in the 1960s by a drunk tourist with a pocket knife. He'd been arrested that same night for vandalizing a nearby bar, but his art lived on in museum glory for 40 years. The museum kept the piece on display, but relabeled it modern graffiti misidentified as prehistoric symbolism. Visitors now laugh as they pass by, proving that even bad decisions can earn immortality if you do them in the right cave. 20. The medieval relic that was a table leg. In the early 1900s, an English museum received what they believed to be a fragment of a medieval cathedral column. It was heavy, ornate, and beautifully carved, a sacred artifact, they declared. For a century, it sat in a velvet-lined case under careful lighting. Then, during a renovation in 2012, curators removed it for cleaning and made a hilarious discovery. One end had screw holes. The cathedral relic was actually a Victorian-era table leg, likely swapped during a messy estate sale decades earlier. Even better, the museum found an old furniture catalog showing the exact model, available for £6 in 1898. Instead of hiding the mistake, the museum embraced it. The leg still sits on display, accompanied by its catalog photo, now serving as a teaching tool on curatorial humility. 21. The ancient map with cartoon pirates. In 1952, a maritime museum in New England acquired what it thought was a priceless treasure map from the 1600s, depicting early trade routes and pirate territories. The parchment was aged, the ink faded, and the symbols beautifully hand-drawn. It quickly became one of the museum's star exhibits. Generations of schoolchildren came to marvel at it, dreaming of buried gold. But when digital restoration technology finally scanned the document in the 2000s, historians noticed something shocking. One of the ships flying across the sea bore a tiny cartoon skull wearing sunglasses. Further inspection revealed the map was actually a novelty placemat from a 1930s seafood restaurant chain that specialized in pirate-themed dining. Someone had treated it with tea and smoke to make it look ancient. The museum quietly laughed it off, admitting that it might not show real trade routes, but it did show how far people will go to fake history. 22. The Egyptian cat statue from a garden center. In 1994, a small-town museum in Illinois proudly presented a bronze Egyptian cat statue believed to date back to 500 BCE. It was sleek, regal, and mysterious, everything a proper artifact should be. Visitors whispered reverently before it, imagining pharaohs and tombs. But when the museum's insurance company demanded an appraisal, the expert couldn't stop laughing. The ancient bronze was actually mass-produced resin, the kind sold at garden centers for $29.99. A staff member had unknowingly bought it years earlier from a local yard sale, assuming it was a rare antique. The museum's board voted unanimously to keep it on display, calling it an educational lesson in optimism. The fake cat is now affectionately known as Bastard of Home Depot. Every year, it wins the museum's unofficial award for Most Photographed Artifact, proving that authenticity is overrated when you've got charisma. 23. The ancient relic made of concrete and rebar. In 2008, archaeologists in Italy unearthed a massive stone fragment they believed to be part of a Roman aqueduct. It had the right texture, the right weight, and even the faint tool marks. After careful transport to a national museum, Researchers began studying its composition, only to find embedded rebar and traces of modern concrete mix. The ancient Roman stone was actually a chunk of a 1940s bridge destroyed during World War II. Somehow, it had been buried deep enough to fool even seasoned experts. The museum quickly rebranded the piece as a modern relic mistaken for the ancient, and it became weirdly popular. Tourists love the irony. One man's wartime rubble is another man's priceless artifact. When the dust settles, every era leaves its mark, even if it's stamped property of the highway department.